Let's begin with a little history. Indulge me a moment of history, won't you? As an LGBTQ person in the United States in 1969, your name, along with those of your friends, along with those of your family, would be listed with the Federal Bureau of Investigation because you would be considered prone to blackmail and to overt acts of perversion. It was a 1950 issue of Coronet magazine that predicted such thinking this way, and I quote, "The male sex deviant descends through perversions to other forms of depravity such as drug addiction, burglary, sadism, even murder. Once a man assumes the role of homosexual, he throws off all moral restraints." End quote. Your name would be monitored by the United States Postal Office that any homosexual trappings received through the mail could be reported to the police, thereby prompting your arrest. But imagine the police knocking on your door every time a shipment from Crate and Barrel arrives. Or, "Excuse me, sir, but is this your Martha Stewart Living magazine?" I mean, imagine it. You would be dishonorably discharged from the military. You would be arrested for holding hands with a partner. Your neighborhood would be periodically swept with the intent to arrest any and all discovered wearing clothes not, and I quote, "for their gender." You'd be fired from your government job, you'd be fired from your teaching job, fired from your professional job without any legal recourse whatsoever. And of course, as was the case until 1973, you would be deemed mentally infirm by virtue of the American Psychiatric Association's classification of homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. So you see, 1960s LGBTQ people were triply condemned. We were condemned by authorities as being criminals, by religion as being sinners, and by medicine as being sociopaths. In 1969 New York, the Penal Code disallowed businesses from providing services to LGBTQ patrons to prevent public premises from becoming, and I quote, "disorderly houses." Apparently, 1969 New York considered homosexuals to be disorderly. I don't get that. Now, given this climate, perhaps it was inevitable that it was organized crime families who opened businesses which did provide services to LGBTQ clientele. And even though the relationship between organized crime families and the New York Police Department was wildly corrupt, these businesses could still expect to be raided at least once each month. Entrapment was little more than an ongoing street game played by New York City police, you see. And so it was that the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar since 1963, had a light cue on the dance floor to forewarn dancers of these raids. You see, touching while dancing was also a punishable offense. And it was on this day in history, June 28th, 1969, that the light cue did its job as usual. But what followed was anything but usual. Instead of acquiescing to the usual demands, those pressed against the walls of the Stonewall Inn on that night refused to show their IDs, refused to identify their genders, refused to leave the property. upon being brutally clubbed in the head, simply for asking that her handcuffs be loosened. One unidentified lesbian shouted to the growing crowd, "Do something. Do something." And amidst the early chants of solidarity and the rising choruses of "We shall overcome," the crowd, by that point, some 10 times its usual size and growing exponentially as patrons from other bars, gay bars, straight bars, joined in support. The days of the Stonewall riots began.
Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
"Do something," she shouted, "do something." And the people responded. And following the days that left that in a smoldering shell, people, gay people and straight people, black people and white people, male and female, old and young, a veritable rainbow palette of humanity, if you will, gathered in Christopher Park to discuss, to plan, to organize, to demonstrate, ultimately giving rise to the first gay pride parade, also on this day in history, June 28th, 1970, and to the establishment of June as Pride Month, CSL Seattle. CSL Seattle. Happy Pride Month. I'm so deeply honored to celebrate with you on this, also poetically, the 17th wedding anniversary which Matthew and I share.
I am open and I am willing to be hopeless. What seems so strange, it dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. There is hurting in my family, and there is sorrow in my town. There is panic across the nation, and there is wailing the whole world round. I am open and I am willing to be hopeless. What seems so strange, it dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. May the children see more clearly, and may the elders be more wise. May the winds of change caress us, even though it burns our eyes. and I am willing to be hopeless. Would be so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. Give me a mighty yoke to hold my confusion. Give me a desert to hold my fears. Give me a sunset to hold my wonder. Give me an ocean to hold my tears. I am open and I am willing to be hopeless. Would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change.
Change, whether in our organizations or our communities or our nations or our world, it seems that meaningful change more often rises from the evolution of individuals than it does from the vision of leaders. Not only does it more often rise from the evolution of individuals, meaningful change often rises in tension with the vision of leaders, in tension with accepted ways, in tension with normative beliefs, in tension with existing systems. This is the real story of Stonewall. It's the story of the rise of that evolutionary impulse within individuals in tension with the very worlds in which they lived. And the story of the rise of that evolutionary impulse within individuals is one that can be limited to no single era and to no single geography. It's one that has neither beginning nor ending. It's one in which each of us has been assigned a role. She was arrested for voting in her hometown of Rochester, New York, and convicted in a wildly public trial. Even so, Susan B. Anthony followed an evolutionary impulse that would ultimately give rise to women's suffrage. You know, one of her many evolutionary contributions as the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That's the story of Stonewall. He was threatened for sabotage, imprisoned for 27 years. Even so, Nelson Mandela followed an evolutionary impulse that would ultimately give rise to expanded equality, fairness, democracy, freedom, the end of apartheid in South Africa. That's the story of Stonewall. And of course, she was arrested for sitting down in defiance of an Alabama law requiring her to relinquish her seat to a white person. Even so, Rosa Parks followed an evolutionary impulse that would ultimately give rise to a bus boycott. And a 1956 Supreme Court decision banning segregation on public transportation. That is the story of Stonewall. He was arrested 5 times. Even so, MLK followed an evolutionary impulse that would ultimately give rise to the end of legal segregation of African American citizens, to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It would earn him a Nobel Peace prize. That is the story of Stonewall. In their exploration of beginnings, the early Hebrews imagined a garden of perfect unity, and they imagined that humanity ate fruit from a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, they imagined humanity chose to incarnate into a level of reality in which perfect unity might experience itself as multiplicity. They imagined that humanity chose to incarnate that life might experience itself as high and low, here and there, hot and cold, light and shadow, beginning and ending. So this story, located in Genesis, isn't really that Adam ate the fruit. You see, the story is that we all ate the fruit. It's the story of what it means to incarnate. It describes the choice to be here in human form. It's the story of perfect unity, experiencing itself as multiplicity. Now, I say fruit. I say fruit because there is no apple in this story. We made that up. At some point in our history, we simply decided that Eve gave Adam an apple, and generations passed that distortion to generations that passed that distortion to generations. There is no apple. And so it begs the question, if humanity managed to so firmly insert that apple into our shared narrative that people are visibly shocked to learn otherwise in 2020, well, what other distortions might we be believing today? But I digress. Said in a different language, all of life shares a source. All of life is an individuation or an emanation of that source. It was Oliver Wendell Holmes who said, and I quote, "My religion is summed up in the first two words of the Lord's Prayer, our Father." Holmes knew that even though the lens of early psychology would imagine that source to be distant, that even though the lens of early mythology would imagine that source to be human, that even though the lens of early patriarchy would imagine that source to be male, those two words, our Father, still say the same thing. All of life has a source, and all of life is an individuation or an emanation of that shared source. It was Ernest Holmes who said it this way, and I quote, "The vital essence of life permeates everything, binding all together in one complete whole." It was Richard Loren Held who said it this way, and I quote, "that each of us has a foot dragging the dust of earth and a hand grasping the infinity of heaven, not sequentially but simultaneously." In other words, each of us has a foot dragging the dust of earth and a hand grasping the infinity of heaven at the same time. And it's not that this experience of foot dragging isn't reality. It's just that this experience of foot dragging isn't the only reality, much less the highest reality of you. And to be more oriented toward that foot dragging the dust of earth is to define life according to human experience. Well, to be more oriented toward that hand grasping the infinity of heaven is to define life according to spiritual nature. There are traditions that would say we have to choose between the two. I do not believe this to be so. We do not have to relinquish one for the other. I think we are to embrace the full gift of this earthly experience, to hug cherished souls, to taste German coffees, to smell cut grass, to hear Chopin concertos. I think we are to embrace the full gift of this earthly experience while recognizing that there are higher realities than those which can be touched, tasted, smelled, or heard. As we become more oriented toward that foot dragging the dust of earth. In other words, as we become more oriented toward the earthly experience than the spiritual nature, we begin to define life as old or young. We define life as male or female, as tall or short, Eastern or Western. And yes, as we become more oriented toward the earthly experience than the spiritual nature, we begin to define life as gay or straight. And most notable of recent days, black and white. And the problem with this level of reality is that far too many fearful humans oriented toward this level of reality eventually weaponize old against young. Far too many fearful humans eventually weaponize male against female, gay against straight, and most notable of recent days, black against white. But as we become more oriented toward that hand grasping the infinity of heaven, in other words, as we become more oriented toward the spiritual nature than the earthly experience, we begin to define life in much broader terms. Labels such as old and young take their appropriate places as we come to grasp that the highest self wasn't born and that the highest self does not die. The highest self has no concept of aging or time or wrinkles around the eyes. The highest self has no attachment to the trinkets over which humanity would do such fierce battle. And labels such as male or female, gay or straight, and thank God for these young people today who are calling us on this simple binary thinking. Labels such as male or female, gay or straight, take their appropriate places as we come to grasp that the highest self is genderless soul stuff, growing, developing, unfolding as best it can through whatever physical form it happens to inhabit at any and every given moment throughout eternity. And labels such as black or white take their appropriate places as we come to grasp that the highest self has no concept of a race or ethnicity. The highest self isn't American or Russian or Chinese. It's not North Korean or South Korean. The highest self couldn't care less about the results from Ancestry.com because the highest self knows that we're all siblings in the same family and that it's a good family. Through the remainder of the Hebrew scriptures and through the remainder of the Christian scriptures, never does humanity find its way back to that garden. Never does humanity find its way home, you see, because to be human is to live here together, east of Eden, wearing these suits of skin, while the highest self of us remembers our sweet unity within that garden. I have to wonder if this remembering of our sweet unity within that garden is the evolutionary impulse which calls the available Susan B. Anthony's of history to remind the rest of us. Women are a part of the garden too, you know. I have to wonder if this remembering of our sweet unity within that garden is the evolutionary impulse which calls the available kings of history to remind the rest of us, people of color, we're part of the garden too. have to wonder if this remembering of our sweet unity within that garden is the evolutionary impulse which calls the available unidentified lesbians of history to remind the rest of us, the LGBTQ, we're part of the garden too. If so, while this story of Stonewall is appropriately dedicated to those individuals who followed such an evolutionary impulse on this day in history, let it be dedicated as well to all who find themselves willing to follow that same evolutionary impulse today, that evolutionary impulse that continues to do what it's always done, that evolutionary impulse that continues to call us up as individuals, that evolutionary impulse that continues to call us together as peoples. That is the story of Stonewall.
Ran away from the sun, ran away from the rain, hid away from everyone, ran away from the pain. Now I'm so out of breath, now I'm so scared to death. I'm not running anymore, I'm not hiding anymore. For the first time in my life, I will stand my ground, no more running round. Here I am, here I am. What's a life covered up? Day and night not to fail. Like a life without love is its own kind of jail. What a waste to regret what I haven't tried yet. I'm not running anymore, I'm not hiding anymore. For the first time in my life, I will stand my ground with my heart unbound. Here I am, here I am, here I am, here I am. Throwing the game just to make sure that I never win. Kept counting myself out again and again. So nervous, running in circles till nobody knew where I'd been. Maybe today is the day that I let it all in. Maybe my secret hurts, no original sin. It's time, I've made up my mind, I'm ready to dive in. I'm not running anymore, I'm not hiding anymore. For the first time in my life, I will stand my ground, I will sing out loud. I'm not running anymore, I'm not hiding anymore. For the first time in my life, I will stand my ground. No more running.